Well, good morning. You guys doing okay? I want to talk about Ubuntu today. Not the operating system, the philosophy made famous by Desmond Tutu, who's a famous South African archbishop in the Anglican Church. Anybody hear of Desmond Tutu before? Anybody heard of Ubuntu as he describes it before? Anybody want to shout out what they think it means? It's a little hard to see. Was that you, Brett? Yeah. You know what it means?
Like each of us, all of us.
Yeah, there's a bunch. It's like anything in another language when you translate it into English, even though it only took one word in that language, it takes like 20 words, and you have to explain it 3 different times in English. But yeah, essentially, it's the idea that a person is a person through other persons, which is a little bit more cumbersome to say than Ubuntu. So here's a couple of quotes of the way that Desmond Tutu describes it. Then I'm going to apply it to each of the elements of this school: character, scholarship, and faith. Okay? So he said, Ubuntu speaks of the very essence of being human. We say, hey, so-and-so has Ubuntu. That means they are generous, hospitable, friendly and caring and compassionate. They share what they have. It is to say, my humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up in yours. We belong in a bundle of life. A person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming of others, does not feel threatened that others are able and good. For he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed, or treated as if they were less than who they are. So a person is a person through other persons. So let's talk about character first. There's a saying by a guy named Jim Rohn, who's one of these motivational speakers, that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. So think about that for a second. So think of the 5 people you spend the most time with, and that you basically end up being kind of an amalgamation of who those people are, what they stand for. In my own life, I've seen this in both positive and negative ways. Sometimes people who I loved spending time with who really lifted me up and made me a better version of myself, and sometimes people who are a total blast to hang out with, but at the end of the day, if I look in the mirror and say, who am I because of these people, sometimes it is a worse version of myself, and maybe that's how I was for them as well. I'm going to give you one quick story from my high school career where I had to kind of reorient myself about it's the people and not what I do. It's not what I do, but who I am. So my freshman year in high school, I ran track. I was a sprinter, and I was the second slowest person on the sprint team. There was one guy who was slower than me, and he literally looked like a turtle. I mean, you know how some people just look like an animal. He looked like a turtle, and he was slower than I was, but everybody else was faster. So I did not do track sophomore year. I did lacrosse. And in high school, I weighed about 103 pounds. And although being a little bit smaller helps with being on the attack for lacrosse, that was pretty small. And I tried my best. I went to a lacrosse camp, and it was taught by some college students. And I just had this, my last day of lacrosse camp, I literally ended up being carried off the field by a long stick defender who had me picked up basically like a shish kebab after he had knocked me down, and then just kind of dropped me on the sideline. And so junior year, I didn't play any sports. I was the sports editor for the school newspaper, though, so I was still involved in sports. But I was kind of struggling with who am I? I don't have this athletic identity. What should I do? And I figured out through basically desperation that there was one thing I was really good at, which was jumping over things. So I would do that kind of recreationally and try to do it in front of people and make them think I was cool. And I was in this little downtown area outside of Detroit near where I grew up, and we were going to a movie, and we parked in a parking structure. And you know how some parking structures, you drive in on the ground level, and then you can go up several levels, but you could also go below ground several levels. So this was one of those structures. So we pull in, park on the ground floor, and then there's exits in the corners of the building, but I know where we're going is basically across the street, so I decide I'm going to impress my friends. I will run and jump over. There was like a wall about this high on the side, and I'll run and I'll just jump over this wall, and then I'll be ahead of the game and on the sidewalk. So, and there was a little like railing along the top. So I ran ahead of my friends and I said, hey, watch this. And I jump, vault myself over, and I'm in the air, and then while I'm in the air, I realize that between where I am and the sidewalk is about 10 feet where it goes to the bottom floor, which is several floors below where I am. And you know when you watch a movie like Die Hard or Mission Impossible or something like that, and they do these things, and you're like, no one could ever really do that. I did one of these things to save my own life. And I don't know how I did it, but it just happened. I reached back on the way down and grabbed with my hand, kind of like this, onto the railing and yanked my arm out of the socket and slammed into the side of the building. And then you can imagine my friends who are still in the parking structure are like, what are you doing? Because they also didn't know about the chasm, otherwise I think they would have told me. Hopefully. So then I'm yelling expletives and help me, and eventually they got me, but they pulled me back up, and I lived to see another day. What does that have to do with Ubuntu? Well, I was trying to have my value as a person wrapped up in what I could do, rather than who I was. And at that time in my life, I had wonderful friends. I had a great relationship with my family members, and yet I was striving to define myself in some other way via achievement and accomplishment. And that moment kind of reoriented me in retrospect, and I realized I need to spend more time kind of valuing myself for who I am and who I am with the people around me. And then I stopped jumping over things without kind of scouting it out first as well. It was another lesson I learned. That's why I'm still here. Okay, what about scholarship? We spend a lot of time and energy here as a faculty talking about what good teaching looks like and what are the pedagogical techniques you'll use and all of that. I met a really successful scholar from the University of Chicago last week who's had this illustrious career as I think a geophysicist. Is that a thing? It's geo and then some science discipline after. Trained at MIT, wildly successful, all that stuff. But he said, we were visiting and I asked him how he got into that. He said the same thing that I have heard countless people say who have excelled in a given field. The most common answer I hear when I ask, how'd you get into that, or how'd you become so successful? He had a professor who just changed his life. And the person he was, the opportunities that he afforded this guy, made him be more intellectually curious, be more successful, and be a better version of himself. Not because of the content of the lesson, but because of who that person was. This happened to me when I was in undergrad at the University of Notre Dame. I was actually a visiting professor from Wheaton College who was teaching a class on Robert Frost and Emily Dickinson, which I was taking to meet a requirement as an English major. And who this guy was changed me. It changed me. He would be down on one knee in tears talking about an Emily Dickinson poem, and it's like 8 in the morning and I'm trying to stay awake, and just who this guy was and the passion that he has. His example, the person he was, really opened up the idea that the English language and the written word could contain so much meaning and beauty, and it made me want to do more of that with my life. So I just think about that, both for our teachers who are in the room and for you. It's not just the discipline in question in each of the subjects that you're taking, right? It's the people and what they're doing with that and who they are and what impact they have on the world that matters. And then on the element of faith, we just baptized our daughter Sienna, I think it was 2 weekends ago. And the reading during the baptism was from the Gospel of Luke. Mr. Lingle, during his chapel talk recently, talked about a passage from the Gospel of Luke where Jesus was healing somebody, and he was known to do this, so he did it more than once. So here's another one, okay? I'm just going to read it quickly and tell you what the priest who baptized our daughter said about it, because it kind of blew my mind. One day Jesus was teaching. This is Luke chapter 5, verses 17 to 26. One day Jesus was teaching, and Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting there. They had come from every village of Galilee and from Judea and Jerusalem. And the power of the Lord was with Jesus to heal the sick. Some men came carrying a paralyzed man on a mat and tried to take him into the house to lay him before Jesus. When they could not find a way to do this because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and lowered him on his mat through the tiles into the middle of the crowd, right in front of Jesus. When Jesus saw their faith, he said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." The Pharisees and the teachers of the law began thinking to themselves, "Who is this fellow who speaks blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Jesus knew what they were thinking and asked, "Why are you thinking these things in your hearts? Which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven, or to say get up and walk? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he said to the paralyzed man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." Immediately he stood up in front of them, took what he had been lying on, and went home praising God. Everyone was amazed and gave praise to God. They were filled with awe and said, "We have seen remarkable things today." So that was the reading for the baptism, and I had heard it many times in my life before, so as you might have just done, it was like, oh yeah, this is the one where they lower the guy on the roof, and then I kind of tuned out and waited until the reading was done to see what the priest was going to say about it. So what he did was focus on one word in that passage which can slip past you, which is, it's when Jesus saw their faith. So when Jesus saw the faith of those 4 friends of this paralyzed guy, who went and basically said, we got to get this guy in front of him. I don't know how we're going to do it. There's a throng of people. Let's climb up on the roof, pull apart the roof. Imagine you're in there, you're hanging out with Jesus. All of a sudden the roof, there's stuff falling down on you. There's a guy being lowered. This is a bizarre event. And when Jesus saw the length that this guy's friends went to, their faith, when he saw their faith, then he said to this guy, your sins are forgiven. So on the occasion of a baptism, one of the things that Father Bill was talking about was the idea of godparents and the family of the person being baptized, that our faith figures importantly in her salvation. This is just not something that had occurred to me before. So I would actually say for each of these things, the point is the stakes are relatively high. The people in your life are not characters in your movie. They are a part of you becoming who you are, and vice versa. You are a part of them becoming who they are. It's not something that we do alone. And I think, I don't know, that's a pretty high stakes thing to realize. And one of the things about it is, and we did this actually before the school year started. We met as a faculty and we went around and we talked about a moment from our own lives and our own education that sticks with us to this day. And I thought it was going to take like 10 or 15 minutes, and it took an hour and kind of derailed the whole day. But it was worth it because I think it proved a pretty important point. A lot of the moments that our teachers cited as something that decades later they still think about when they think about their own formation and education. These were moments that I doubt the teacher involved woke up that morning, put on a tie, drank some coffee, and said, I'm going to change that kid's life today. I'm going to do something today that they're going to think about for decades, and they're going to build their career and their vocation on this thing I'm going to do today. I would say in most cases, they were just there doing their job that day, right? So we don't ever know ahead of time when one of these moments is coming, one of these times where we are figuring very prominently in the formation of our friend or our student or our teacher or our parents. So it's something that I think it's worth cultivating an awareness of and thinking about today with the people with whom I come into contact. I am a big part of their life, of them becoming who they are. Am I open to it? And if this is true, and I realize it's true, is it going to impact the way that I treat them, talk to them, talk about them? So let's work on cultivating that awareness of this amazing interactional truth. And I'll leave you with one last way that I've heard Ubuntu translated, which is, I am because you are. So let's think about that and let it impact the way we act today. Have a good one.